Our speaker today is Professor Andrew McDonnell, who's the CEO here at Studio 3 and a passionate campaigner against the use of restraint and seclusion. Andy's going to be speaking for around 45-50 minutes tonight about physical intervention myths in the crisis management training industry. Andy, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. By the joys of modern technology, we will share my screen and hopefully I won't mess it up, but there we go. Okay, so yes, well, first of all, thank you for joining on a Monday night. This is part of our free webinar series at Studio 3, which has been going on literally since the first lockdowns, for those of you who can remember that. Well, I'm Andrew McDonnell. I'm the lead clinical psychologist for Studio 3. And yes, I'm the originator of my own training organisation, my colleagues called Studio 3 Training Systems. But tonight, I want to talk about an area that I'm not sure I even like anymore, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. The whole topic of what we call physical interventions. And what I'm going to try and do is to give you a perspective, one that I passionately believe in and my colleagues do, about asking the question, what do we need physical interventions for? And more appropriately, who should receive training and who shouldn't? So I'm going to present a very personal view about those physical interventions. At some point in this, I will occasionally use, I deliberately chose visuals that I don't want to really be too difficult for people to view, but I'll give people notice if I show any physical interventions or videos like that or descriptions. But hopefully today, we can kind of combine a practitioner view with also what the research tells us, which is actually really calls into question why we even teach these skills in the first place. So, without much further ado, having a meaningful dialogue about physical interventions, and I'm going back over 35 years of working in this industry, is really, really difficult. Now, often will people talk about things around the physical interventions. You know, prevention is better than intervention, which is true. Or they'll distract onto other debates. This is a natural human process for me. But people don't actually want to talk about the interventions themselves. I should also declare a conflict of interest that I was one of the original members of the Build Working Party in the 90s that started our first standards in this country. And I want to say to anyone watching this, that I'm quite proud of the fact that the UK is quite world leading in terms of having some standards. The Build Work has now evolved into the Restraint Reduction Network, and we have a lot more regulation for the training industry than we had before. But I will argue today that we've only really just begun. We're really still scratching the surface of what could be done in terms of standards, safety, and really asking those questions in this country in particular and around the world about why do we need this training. And over the years myself, I've heard so many myths spoken in this field about training. My first attendance as a training course was when I was actually a young practitioner before I was qualified in the 1980s. And I was on a training course with two guys. It's supposed to be called Managing Aggression. I won't say who they are. And after a short talk and a little bit of theory, they got the gym mats out and started showing us physical techniques. Now, I had a few reservations about that, given that the other declaration is, well, I'm retired now, but I did achieve a rank at a very high level in a martial art jiu-jitsu. And I watched these people clearly trying to convey this information to people in the hope, and a good hope, that it would reduce fear and staff injuries. And actually, it started to call into question the whole reason of why I was there. So you can find it in my books, but further on from that, I decided to explore what research there was out there, and this is in the 80s, and it was pitiful. Research on de-escalation methods, research on actual restraint methods or the eradication of them, and the types of methods and safety. And in this talk, I'm going to take you through some of the myths that I've experienced over the years, and I'm going to finish with a positive message, and it's not a sales pitch in a way, but just about how we operate at Studio 3, because we still do teach some physical interventions on some programs in Studio 3. The opening myth is that we don't teach anything at all, but we are minimalists and have become more and more minimalists over the years. So hopefully, in this journey, we can have a number of discussions, because actually what I want to do personally over the next few years is actually have more open debate about these topics. It really is becoming important to get to the next level, and we do need to start talking in the future about methods that we shouldn't be teaching, methods that actually maybe should be even outlawed. So we know that physical restraint is a response to crisis situations, and I'm sure many of the people on this talk, including myself, have been in situations where we've had to restrain people. I've had to do that quite a lot, particularly as a young practitioner. Now, we also know that seclusion is probably a little bit more involved. There's a lot of debates about what it is. When I first qualified, seclusion was defined under the Mental Health Act as a room, usually a lockable door, where you detain someone in crisis. It's become much vaguer now over the years as a terminology. I couldn't believe it 10, 15 years ago when I started seeing schools talk about having their own seclusion policies. It's just something that makes me cringe when we get to that level. You know, but the primary goal of all these methods is to keep all people safe. And I'm using the word all people safe, not just staff, not just parents, but children and adults as well. And what I've found over the years in the industry around this is that sometimes training organisations seem to err to one extreme to the other. I remember a very famous training programme that's worldwide that I went on their training course years ago. It felt like a kung fu course, to be perfectly honest. But at the end of it, all I've heard this main trainer talk about was staff safety. He didn't mention the safety of the individuals we were supporting once. So I make no apologies to say that I come from an organisation that started at the other end. But let's debunk another myth. If we're talking about restrictive practices, reducing and eliminating them cannot be a debatable subject. And it's not just about science, it's also a human rights issue. So, the term physical interventions is an interesting one I want to talk about. Is it arose by another name? That term started to be used increasingly in the late 1990s onwards. In my view, it was used more in the UK. I remember at one of the Build Working Party meetings in the late 90s, the term was suggested to be adopted. There was a vote. I was on the losing side because I didn't like the term, because I felt the word physical and interventions sounded too positive. It sounded like we were doing something. And even calling them interventions, I still think to this day is a mistake. I felt that we would avoid words like seclusion and restraint and create arose by another name. And we've certainly, I think that's the situation to do it today. I still dislike the term. It's caught on, but I think actually these days, without specificity, it's practically meaningless. So actually, from my point of view, we need to be very careful that if we mean restraint, we talk about restraint. If we mean seclusion, we talk about seclusion. Even in the areas of restrictive practices, if we're talking about punishments and sanctions, call them that. Don't call them some fancy other name. I've lost count of the number of seclusion isolation areas that have fancy names. I remember years ago going to a special school, not in this country, where they had a soft play area that had a lock on it. So it was used for soft play, snoozing in the day, but sometimes in crisis, a child would be put in there and they would lock the door. Now, arguably, if you can't escape from a situation, then that's some form of unlawful detainment or seclusion. And I think that one of the battlegrounds for our work in this country over the next, and Ireland too, and parts of Europe over the next 5 years, is the alarming levels of restrictive practices that seem to be used in schools. I can point people to the recent Challenging Behaviour Foundation survey and the work of Beth Morrison and her colleagues, ICARS, International Coalition Against Restraint and Seclusion, that shows quite alarmingly high levels of the use of these methods, particularly in the special needs sector, but other sectors too. So even though I dislike the term, I lost the vote. As some colleague of mine said, you just need to suck it up and accept, yes, the term is too vague, but it's a term that's caught on. So, what I'm going to be talking about today, and as I said, declaring an interest that I run a training organisation, is I think the whole training industry is something that I would call the restraint industrial complex. Think about how many people around the world, particularly in the Western world alone, receive physical interventions training in one day of all different forms. We think it's a really high number. And it's a particularly high number when we realise there isn't a lot of training on the impact or the effectiveness of that type of training. I remember being on a really helpful training course in the 90s where a person said, as soon as I taught you these skills, by the time you walk out the door, you'll begin to forget them. That phrase stuck with me for years, well, ever since, because they're absolutely right. So we can't estimate, even in the UK, how many people are in receipt of that training, but it's quite high. We've ranged on figures of estimating education, UK health and social care staff, other settings, and the figure's quite high. And when we apportion cost to that, particularly in the NHS, It's a phenomenal amount of money that's been spent on training, which includes physical interventions. Yeah. Just think about how many people right now today are somewhere in this country on a training course which will have as elements of it physical interventions. I'm alarmed at this, and I'm alarmed at the fact that physical interventions for me is something, or that area is something that should be prescribed and targeted, not a blunderbuss approach to these methods. And it's really still concerning me to this day that the situation hasn't changed that much. Yeah. As I said, there are entities, we have much more regulation. It is a taboo subject though. And I think any discussion of this subject matter is going to be healthy and good. So I'm just giving a word of warning. Over the next 3 or 4 years, I intend to be talking wherever I can and my colleagues can openly. It's okay for training providers to disagree. And in the very early days of the work I did with the British Institute of Learning Disabilities, one of the nice things about it was to be able to disagree with opposing trainers and training organisations. And actually, over time, there are a number of organisations and people that I actually became quite friendly with. Not all, though, for very good reason. But this idea of an open, transparent discussion has to be the next agenda for this, not distracting people away from the methods themselves. It's a small part of what we do, but it's a very important part of what we do. So rather than minimise it, let's be open, let's be frank. And that's what really the theme of this presentation is. Yeah. Even when we talk about the methods indeed themselves, I published an article in a book called Ethical Approaches to Physical Interventions 2 in 2008, where myself, a colleague called David Ledbetter, Alan Martin, Brodie Patterson, actually we sat in a room and we drew randomly some methods, physical intervention methods, and we came up with an assessment protocol for whether we thought methods looked safe or whether they looked okay. Now, I got excited once that was published because I finally thought we could start talking about methods. And then the agenda moved on. Now, I understand from my colleagues at the Restraint Reduction Network that agenda is here now. But I will urge anyone, if they want to look at a methodology where you can give opinion, expert panel opinion about methods, that's still there and it's in the public domain. And I recommend people look at it. For me, I just wanted to prove the point that we can't turn around and say all methods are equally safe, because that's nonsense. Yes, it depends on the level of training, the environment, a whole range of factors, but we cannot be saying that certain methods are inherently safe. And that's what that debate is about. And I'm hoping in the future that we can push this further, that we can get organisations like the RRN to take these things to the next level, rather than just being advisory. I'm pretty sure that if we got enough people with expertise in the room and we took a consensus, there would be a number of physical intervention methods that would be banned. And I hope that we can get to that level in the UK. I believe we can, but I think we need to be open and frank in debates, get beyond the kind of catcalling, and actually start talking about detail. To be absolutely clear, though, I would rather ban everything if I had my way philosophically. But there is a limited place for crisis management methods. There is a limited place for restraint to keep people safe, but it's small in my opinion. So think about it this way. If we train fewer staff in physical interventions, but train less staff in them, we would have more time to train them properly and coach them and make sure these methods are safe and sanctioned. That would be my argument. So the fact that we now have a system that doesn't really seem to accredit any interventions, they accredit organisations effectively, just seems a little crazy and daft to me. But I think we do have the platform here to move beyond this in our work. Again, if we take this in even more detail, we need to think about some of the basics. In all the approaches that I've ever taught, and I am a psychologist, we are dealing with highly traumatized and distressed individuals. Yeah? People aren't necessarily have a plan to attack us or ruin our life or harm us, but often the people we're working with, not just in autism, people who are traumatized, are melting down. And often we need to think about empathic approaches like my colleagues and I approach the low arousal approach. It says in a crisis situation, I need to keep people safe, but I also need to respect someone's dignity. I also need to avoid the use of physical interventions as much as I can. I published an article with a colleague of mine called Roy DeVoe, who's now still at the Tizard Centre. I think he has an honorarium. And we published it 12 years ago, talking about the last resort. And in this article, we said, unfortunately, the last resort can often become the first resort. And I think one of the issues we have is that I think we start with some ideals, which is If the cornerstone of crisis management is developing relationship with distressed people, restraint in itself cannot, and the seclusion cannot be helpful in that process. We also know that physical interventions like restraint are highly traumatizing, not just for the poor vulnerable person who's being held, but also for the people supporting them, be they families or care staff. So we can all agree these are traumatizing, then I think the minimisation and eradication is possible. Eradication on a case-by-case basis is definitely possible. I don't know if people ever noticed that actually it's very difficult in the way our hospitals are designed and the psychiatric services where we herd distressed people together. What's the point of herding distressed people together in terms of helping people with their mental states? That doesn't necessarily mean that we're sending someone who's distressed into a calm, regulated environment. What we're doing is sending people into a controlled environment, which again has a place, but actually again, the logic isn't there. And relationships are important, even in crisis management and relationship building. I remember, as an example, years ago, before I qualified, I was working as a care worker, and I was working with a young man actually with a whole range of conditions, but included a learning disability, and he started throwing objects at me in the room. He just literally melted down. I didn't have much training then, but I kind of worked out the last thing I needed to do was grab hold of him. So I got the other people out of the way in an institutional setting. I began to talk to him, kept social distance. As I started to talk to him, he seemed to calm down. I don't even think he knew why he was that distressed. And then the door opened and in came the response team. And I witnessed him becoming even more aggressive as soon as they entered the room. I didn't call them. It's one of the things I learned as a young practitioner. Those people were not bad people. They just were a bit like the Keystone Cops in the old movies. That's how people responded. And we still see too much of that to this day. We don't want to see our colleagues or people getting hurt, but often we don't think about the fact that the very process of intervening can itself have an excitatory effect. So, I mentioned my true confession. I'm now retired. I was a sixth dan in the martial arts jiu-jitsu. I never used to say it because I didn't want people to know that I had that as a hobby, and that's all it is. But it did qualify me to go on training courses and say that something is technically difficult to teach or too complex or would inflict pain. But one of the things I've always talked to people about when we get people with a martial arts or military background in this industry is on a lot of our training in self-defense is based on mind over matter. You don't mind what you do because the other person doesn't matter. You hear all these what ifs. What if you're in a dark alley? What if there's a knife? What if somebody's got a knife? But often in places where we train people, they're in a caring context where relationship building is important. If you're a parent, be very careful about using some of these strategies because it will damage your relationship with your children. I passionately believe that. And there's another example I give parents. If you put a 2-year-old in a naughty step, in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, they'll put you there. Because social learning works both ways. So the people we support, the phrase I use is I do mind what I do because the other person almost definitely matters. Now, for anyone who's got a martial arts background and is upset with me saying that, the concept of self-defense may well be about getting away, but it's also about doing proportionate things, sometimes extreme things, to get away from people, but sometimes it's at the next level. And the problem is with a lot of training courses I've seen that include physical interventions, there's still a lot of that ethos within the training. Somebody said to me once, could you teach me self-defense? I said I could. I said, would you like me to just take all the violent bits out of my martial art and just show you that and you clap at the end of the session? And they said yes. So I said no. I said, I'm afraid this is about developing yourself. It's about learning other things, not just a few simple tricks. Yet we do training courses these days that are full of an overwhelming number of physical tricks that people forget as soon as they start leaving the classroom. Right. The thing about the visuals with this, though, is for anyone who really doesn't like seeing these things, just for about the next minute, I'm going to show you some examples, some visuals of what we're talking about here. These are not representative of all methods. And when they're finished, I'm going to, those of you who don't really want to see that, just look away from your screen because it's only going to be for a few seconds. And I have sanitized these as well because I don't really want people to see the worst. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, here are the slides. So we can have things like hold downs of various kinds. We can have things that involve what we call pain compliance, the deliberate infliction of pain to control an individual. When you inflict a lot of pain like this, as you see in this visual, it will shut down the nervous system. Now, that's a method that the police force and other groups are very familiar with, the army, the military, but I would argue they have no place in care environments, because often you're inflicting quite extreme pain on the individual, and that creates problems itself. There are also methods, numerous methods, that require an awful lot of force to do on somebody of a certain size. This is an example of something called a basketball, of which I still know some organisations teach variants of today. And it needs to stop, in my opinion. Similarly, this is actually an open case of somebody who had a tether attached to a vest in Holland. You can Google him, it's called Brandon Vanningen. Yeah. And a Dutch High Court ruled that that wasn't restrained because he could get the vest off. It was designed so that a staff member could be within, and as soon as he got aggressive, they could get him out of the room. To me, this is the craziness when I hear people talk about mechanical restraints being safer. Yeah, they're also quite stigmatizing. And yes, some people say they have better mechanical restraints, but I'm not so sure myself. So what we've had is this emerging mythology all the time. You can look away now, there's no more negative images again, for those of you who wanted to do that. There's a mythology that's grown up around here, and I've selected a few things that I will call myths to actually look at. Yeah. Now, a lot of things I'm going to point to you about, you can find in an open source review that I recently published in a journal called Frontiers, called Staff Training in Physical Interventions, a literature review. If you Google my name, you'll get to that. It's an open source journal. And what this is over maybe 25 years, I've done different literature reviews of saying, what's the actual research out there about any training that includes physical interventions? The first review I did was actually unofficially, it's in 2004, and I've done short chapters in books, but this is finally an updated comprehensive review. And it makes very grim reading if your evidence base is about science. One of my arguments is very clear. This is one level of information, but if you accept that there's not a lot of evidence for the training that we do collectively, then the next stage is what is acceptable evidence? And then the next stage after that is not hide behind waiting for the evidence. Physical restraint and seclusion, right now today, people in this country and in Ireland, across Europe, have been restrained today with a variety of methods that have very little evidence base about whether we train staff and it has an impact on reducing injuries. Right now, today. So this is not an area like COVID, or we develop a vaccine where we study it, we do clinical trials, and then we throw that out there to the masses to say which is best. We're well beyond that. And one of the reasons why I'm going to talk about this lack of evidence is that I think people hide behind it too much, to be quite frank. What we need to accept is the level of evidence is poor, to say the least. Even for this literature review to include certain articles, we have to bend the rules. So actually what we're saying is there's not a lot of studies out there, and what's out there aren't that impressive. I dropped a number of my own studies out of this list because I didn't think they were even worthy of meeting the criteria for it. That's the level of where we are. Right. And in that review, there's one quotation I'd like people to think about. And it says, despite physical intervention training being widely used in care services, there is little evidence to support the effectiveness and the application of physical interventions. And this is the fact that a lot of these studies are training studies where there's a lot of very little data collected on the outcomes and the impact. It's actually quite frightening, really. But what I don't want people to do personally is to then say we need to set up this definitive study to answer those questions. We can't wait. It's a nice thing to do, but we can't wait another 5 or 10 years to get some definitive data. We should do it, but it shouldn't stop us looking at our standards, our regulations, and what we're doing right now. This would be what we call evidence-based practice. What I'm talking about would also be practice-based evidence, getting experts together, actually saying, what do we know is best practice? And I think the RRN work and the Bill work before it is in that space. But it would be nice to finally conduct some studies around this that are meaningful. One of the other problems is most of these studies these days have been conducted by people with training interests in the past. And they didn't necessarily declare them on their papers or articles in their declaration of interest. Fortunately, these days we have to, when we're submitting papers or articles in there, you have to declare your interest. So it's not a great database. The next myth that I think is really quite worrying is that restraint will calm people down. I remember some work by my colleague Rebecca Fish and Chris Hatton, where they interviewed women in forensic units about their experiences of restraint. Very few people said, I was really happy with it. I was delighted. It was wonderful. Very few, funnily enough. What you had were things like, you can't move. How does it feel? Horrible, hate it, makes me more angry. Does it help you calm down? No. This is representative of the vast majority of distressed people we work with. So why aren't we listening to our customers a bit more? You could argue, for example, that environmental containment is better than laying hands on people. You could argue there is a limited case for controlled seclusion or withdrawal from a situation to get other people out of the way, what I actually call tactical withdrawal in my recent book. But what we have is almost a mythology that we just have to do these things. It's not our fault. Similarly, there is this research from the animal research that's been going back for about 60 years, that often when you hold particularly animals that are not used to being held, the most common thing you get is elicited aggression. That means the animals often become more aggressive. They don't seem to habituate and get used to being held. You have elicited aggression quite a lot in my career, where I've seen people held, often for reasons that I'm sure were valid at the time to keep people safe, but actually my record is someone who needed 8 people to hold them down. If you're going to use that many people, you're using an awful lot of force to contain someone who's in a state of what we might call excited delirium. And I've been involved in those situations. And actually, I've seen staff injured, I've seen clients injured. And it's one of the mythologies, again, about these methods. We want to be careful about keeping injury data, because actually quite a lot of people, significant proportion, 1 in 20 is one study that I read, are actually injured in the application of these methods. Now, you could turn around and say, well, that's because the staff aren't trained. No, that method figures even for staff who have been trained. Many years ago, there was a study done about what we used to call the old-fashioned control and restraint training, and it was a survey done of psychiatric nurses in the UK, 338, where over 20% of them said they'd been mildly injured on a training course. Now, that doesn't mean to say that people had their bones broken on a training course, but they had bruises that were abrasions or scratches that would be minor injuries. There was a significant smaller proportion that said that they'd actually been physically injured, and that included breaking bones. What worries me is that training courses themselves and going on training courses in controlled environments aren't necessarily inherently safe. And the problem is the safety measures we put in those environments, in a training room, don't necessarily are in place in a care environment. I remember we stopped teaching hold downs in Studio 3, well, we never did really, but even in the early 90s. And one of the problems I had with the methods is if you hold someone down, often you're expecting people to crash into carpets, not crash mats, or holding them down on floors. You can talk about controlled descents, but in reality, a lot of people get injured in those processes. So, how do we get with all the myths? Well, one of my favourite myths is that all physical interventions have similar roots and are the same. I was talking to a leading practitioner of a very large training organisation who I get on quite well with, and he told me that he had copyrighted all of his physical movements. My response was, I don't see how you can do that easily, given that in this sphere, you then have to start talking about the history of the methods, where they came from. Quite a lot of the methods we see on training courses, I know, come from adaptations of different martial arts, from Aikido to even versions of karate, judo, jiu-jitsu. That's the lineage of a lot of these methods. So what we need to be thinking about is that the methods themselves, remember, are different questions we're designing for, which is that we need to think about the whole crisis response. So we need to think in more detailed level. A lot of the methods we use in Studio 3, whether they're restraint or minor, what they call physical interventions, involve very, very rapid use of methods. What we call hold, move, and let go is often used, where you're immediately letting go of someone, momentary holding. Yeah, we've been doing this since the 90s. It looks a little bit crazy and weird. I'll show you an example later in the talk to show that maybe I'm not completely crazy. Yeah, this method we developed specifically was one method that involved not putting someone on the floor. You contain an individual, you use movement, you back off from that individual. It's much more like a dance. They now call this the walk around method, and I'm proud to be associated with it as one method. It's not perfect, it's not fantastic, but compared to holding someone down on the ground in a crisis, there's quite a lot of advantages to do momentary holding. So There's another myth that worries me the most, which is that staff training reduces injuries to staff, that includes physical interventions. I'm afraid the evidence base from that literature review is very mixed. Some training courses may, under some circumstances, we teach people these skills and fewer people get injured. But there's so little data and information, it's really a big assumption that we do this training, we hope the information sticks, and we hope it reduces staff and client injuries. Believe it or not, there's a lot of good data. When I said to you about studies, there was an independent review of one of our own training programs in Denmark, and they did report some reduction in staff injuries, but it wasn't zero. It wasn't elimination. It was significant reductions. There were also significant reductions in days off sick. But the reason why I point this study out isn't to say it's the best or the worst. I think it has lots of flaws, but at least it was conducted independently, unbeknown to myself and my colleagues at the time. And I'm encouraging more and more organisations to have independent, genuinely independent reviews of your training. That's how we learn and we adapt it. Similarly, in the studies that we found in our own organisation, de-escalation and advanced de-escalation is what people say they need to be taught more of. But we do have a problem. So although we say it's a myth that staff training and physical interventions may reduce injuries, a lot of people who go on training courses believe the narrative. A lot of trainers who deliver training also believe that narrative. So it's a very benign thought. We do this training, we hope the information sticks. I was even involved in a project, and I can't say where a very large insurance underwriter asked us about the whole issue about the evidence base for training. They weren't very happy when we told them it's very limited. But they were also unhappy to not underwrite organisations that didn't have an established training programme. So you end up in this chicken and egg that actually, for defensive medicine's point of view, it's quite important to have training that includes physical interventions. But actually, if we unpick the evidence, it's a myth that training automatically reduces injuries. There's even one study, and I won't say which one it is for other reasons, where physical intervention uses actually went up after training. That was done by a very open, good researcher who I thought was very honest in the 90s to point that out to people. We shouldn't assume what we're teaching is benign, is the point of this. So it's a myth for me about staff training in this area. Another myth, and I think it's a pseudo myth, is that some people like being restrained. If the answer is yes, it's a very small minority of people. There's a study done in Scotland by a colleague of mine, and there are others too, on young people. Laura Steckley, who did this study, and it's been quoted and quoted and quoted. I've often seen in the literature that some of the people she interviewed in her qualitative study, young people, said they didn't want to hurt other people, and actually they preferred being restrained. This has been blown out of proportion to almost be representative of all the people we restrain. It's very true that a lot of people, particularly if they're regulated afterwards, don't want to hurt people. So really that question was based on those people's experiences, which are valid, but they were not, to me, representative of the populations of people, even young people that my colleagues and I work with. And I think we've got to be careful. Laura's a good researcher, that we don't take something like that and then we extrapolate it to some extreme idea. It's actually one of the most common heuristics and biases, which is where we take some data and then we actually extrapolate it to the general population, even though the data is very limited. So I think it definitely is a myth. Now, that's my opinion, and I will stand by my opinion. That work was very useful work. Understand people's experiences and lived experiences is huge in this area. So the study itself, I think, has a place. It's just when other people use it, I've heard them use it in that way, and it bothers me. Similarly, pain compliance is necessary. It's just a moral debate. I haven't to use any of these sort of things in my career. I don't. Pain compliance is a very effective tool, but so is a pepper spray. So is a number of other physical techniques that can disable someone. A pellet shotgun. Where do you draw the line with these things? And I know where I draw the line in care. Yeah, and particularly the environments that I've worked in, both in secure, as some of you might be thinking, he's never worked in secure environments. Yes, I have, or community environments. Pain compliance is something that we should not include within our general work in the caring environments, in my opinion, because it opens the door to too many arguments about what is proportionate. Leave that to the lawyers. Inflicting pain on someone to control them will often elicit a violent response back. People don't say, thank you for hurting my wrist. Thank you for almost inflicting a blinding brief pain or shock to me to help immobilise me. This is an example again of where it's actually confusing the area we work and the people we support with other sectors in the kind of training industry. I don't teach police officers how to use pain compliance on a person who's wielding a knife. It's not my area, and I don't want it to be. I wouldn't advise those individuals on how to control a riot either. But the problem becomes is when we extrapolate some of these things into our field, and that's always been the problem as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Often people ask these things, and we need to deliberately inflict pain. It may hurt, but actually we're trying to control you in the situation and keep people safe. Those philosophical justification arguments just open doors. I've seen policies that make statements similar to that. You might as well not bother to have a policy because it allows even more openness. I heard somebody say once that you can do anything in self-defense to protect yourself as long as it's proportionate. But the context is important with that. Don't write, as I saw in one policy recently for a school in the UK, only use the method you're taught. However, in exceptional circumstances, and if you feel your life is threatened, then obviously do what you need to. If you write that in a policy, how do you know that somebody's had a proportionate response to a situation? The answer is you don't. So for me, we have to have general guidance in policies that says the do's and don'ts. Generally speaking, I would never justify and allow the door route to pain compliance methods. What I would say in the industry, things have changed very positively over the last 20 years. I know fewer and fewer organisations routinely teach those types of methods anymore, but some still do. Now, I get the argument that we don't want anyone to be hurt, but actually deliberately using pain on someone isn't necessarily a calming approach, especially when you consider most of the people we're working with, again, are distressed, confused, traumatised, sometimes confused in terms of their mental state. The ends doesn't always justify the means. Yeah. I'm putting this as a myth that people say there are no alternatives because people say it in meetings to me. Once you say that, it becomes mythology. There are no alternatives. We always talk about the least restrictive approaches. We take the opposite view. We believe there are always alternatives, and we work from that premise, not from what can we do? There was no alternatives. Each time we use a physical intervention, it's a learning experience to people say, how do we not do that next time? It's a very simple rule if you want to eliminate restraints and seclusions. Not just debrief staff emotionally and support them and all those other standards, but actually ask the question, how do we not do that next time? Sometimes that involves not changing a routine for somebody. It may involve somebody not getting out of bed in the morning. It may involve changing a program. It may involve us just taking a step back or getting people out of the way. But that is active learning. And organisations, whether they're highly staffed or not, that use that active learning protocol, which is what my colleagues and I support at Studio 3, that is often what makes the difference. So actually there are always alternatives. That's the mindset we should have. So when we're thinking about their alternatives, I've tried to get people to understand that there are negative narratives. Yeah. I'm particularly interested myself. I'm still banning. I ban an awful lot of methods in the field that we routinely train on training courses. And one of the reasons isn't just a moral one, it's because some of the methods that are taught anyway are so complicated, I would defy anyone to actually be able to recall those methods afterwards. I remember being on a training course years ago as a mystery customer, I won't say where, and the person training at the end of it, I just said, oh, well, it's very interesting the way you taught your methods, got a little conversation. And I said, but what would you do if somebody grabbed you in this particular way? And he went, do that again. I said, well, what methods do you teach for this? And he said, I sometimes forget some of these methods. We get so embroiled in learning the methods that we forget about de-escalation, he said to me. I still think that's part of it. There is also the myth of encouraging catastrophizing. We always know that people can get hurt. There have been restraint-related deaths. There have been staff who've been severely injured. We've had very famous cases of teachers who've been stabbed outside of their schools. But these are the vast minority. The vast majority of physical aggression is verbal in nature, not physical. So if we get better at de-escalation, that's part of it. But this catastrophizing happens a lot in this industry. I don't want anyone to get hurt. I want to be clear here. I don't want anyone to be injured. I want to minimise our training and have an evidence base across the training to say we can help, but not to make blanket assumptions that actually a knee-jerk reaction to somebody is part of that. I'll give you the best example I know of knee-jerk reactions, and it's always about people talking about what would you do if somebody had a knife? Well, my honest answer is I would run if I could. Right? Well, what if you backed into a corner? Then I'm in trouble, because I'm sorry, teaching somebody over a few days how to take a knife off someone is far more dangerous than not teaching them, because people forget as soon as they go out of the classroom. That's a very high skill method. Even the police forces will tell you that as well. Our prison services will tell you that, a whole range of sectors. So what was our approach? And I want to finish this in a far more positive way on this talk. And our approach kind of evolved out of this. My original work on training, which goes back to the late 80s and 90s particularly, and since, was to focus on methods and physical methods. And I put really 4 things around physical interventions for me. They grew from 3 to 4. One is the methods we should teach should be safe for all parties concerned. That involves not teaching things that by, as my colleague David Ledbetter called it, fragility. If you subtly change a method from here to here, that you're going to really inflict pain. He called those techniques fragile. Methods should be effective. I remember at a conference once, somebody said, so you can teach methods that aren't effective that look nice. And my answer was, yeah, but what would be the point? Social validity is a big part of our work. And this comes from a construct that says methods should be socially valid. You should be able to apply a method of physical intervention in Tesco's or in a public area and not have somebody call the cops. Social validity, those immediate judgments people make in a social context about something that's happening that they're observing. Social validity, I did quite a lot of research on this in the early days in my career. It has its place. But socially valid, effective and safe methods is what we should be looking at. The other thing is about ecological validity. It's a fancy term in science, but it also means it's about the, if you like, the goodness of fit of some of these methods. I often see things that are taught in classrooms with maths that have no translatable effect if you're on a hospital ward or you're in a care home. So we've always started with those, and there are many other principles about we want to minimise the use of these methods. We also don't want to teach methods that involve contained holding for prolonged periods of time. And these principles have evolved. I put them in my books in the public domain. I'm not saying we're paragons of virtue, but we're putting it out there. The goal of Studio 3 training was to have other people copy what we do. It wasn't actually to say we're going to try and control the world and monopolise this market, but it was about to be an ideas organisation, and it still is. We want to challenge people to do better. We want to challenge ourselves to do better when we're looking at this area. Yeah. The other principles developed over the years: allow individuals opportunities to regulate, no sustained holds. That meant avoid traumatizing postures. Holding people down, face down, is the most common form of sexual assault posture. Avoid them. Use natural movements, not overly complicated movements. Try not to use methods that involve direct pain on individuals. Always do whatever physical interventions you do as slowly as possible when you practice them, because basically when our amygdalas overheat and we're frightened, we become hypervigilant. So everything should be done as slow as you possibly can. I've been involved in many situations as a young practitioner where people literally rush in. You know the phrase, fools rush in where angels fear to tread? No, just fools rush in. Slow, calm, regulated. We need to model regulation for people who are dysregulated. Yeah. We also had something called the Pied Piper method, which actually involved drawing attention to yourself. If you want to get someone to follow you out to an open space or an open area, draw their attention to you. Often people will focus on you. We have methods like that to do that. But the general thing is teach as few physical interventions as possible on any training course, because people start to forget these skills. If you want to think about a skill like CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, have a look at the research, if you don't believe me, about how hard it is to maintain that skill. Now, you could argue that there are certain members of the population who need that skill to a high level. Absolutely true, paramedics and others. But there is a real debate about whether generalised CPR, and we've had national campaigns on this, is as effective. So what we need to do is teach less, but teach those methods when we have to, well. And that involves often training, coaching on the ground, not just train on what we call hope in this area. You do some training and you hope the information sticks. Other principles we use is that we develop systems where we don't like the use of sanctions and punishments. I'm sorry, that's a moral argument. We will differ from other people. No, it's just not something that I think is a really great idea. And it is a moral argument. We avoid the high use of higher staffing levels with people because we gather staff to reduce conflict, but actually it can be illicit aggression. And actually when staff become too dependent on having bodies around them to feel safe, what we can't do is then easily reduce those numbers. Giving corrective feedback to people, I'm putting staff here, carers and others, is an essential part of the dynamic. And similarly, confidence and perceived confidence is central to our work. The more you make people feel they're confident, the more likely it is they're going to present themselves in a more confident way to people. That's the assumption, and there is a limited amount of evidence at the moment that that is the case. Yeah, but generally our work in principle is about fear reduction. I've been scared in situations, I'm sure other people have too. If we can reduce stress and fear in those situations by having our responses more measured and calm, this is where we need to be. But a word of warning, there's quite a lot of training organisations who adhere to these principles, but what do they do in practice is the next level. Yeah, we adopt these principles. But what does it mean in practice? So, my research came from the idea that movement and emotion are integrally linked. This goes back to psychological research even from the last 100 years. Certain movements, certain postures evoke certain emotional responses in people. So, if we want to de-escalate situations, we need to teach movements that are at a lower intensity level, not just movements around charging in to contain someone. And that is the area that I'm most fascinated in the future. How momentary holding and movements can do that. I was talking to someone actually only last week who said we used that walk around method and the person almost was a bit surprised because they were expecting us to put the person down on the ground. And what I tried to say to them was, how you're taught to do this is important. Relax, allow your body to move. Don't use rigid movements. Similarly, when we use the walk around method, it's only one method, but we teach it as our escort method, and actually it requires 2 people. It doesn't require 3, 4, or 5. It's not about immobilizing someone for prolonged periods of time. It's much more like a dance or a wave on the ocean. These are much harder, these methods, to teach because they have a higher skill level. But if you're teaching fewer assisted interventions, it allows you more time on training and coaching to have a higher skill level. But even these methods have a limited place. They shouldn't be broadly taught. So an example, here's a couple of visuals. These are not alarming visuals. The walk around method can involve holding people, using movement. Sometimes you let go of someone, but you work with a partner and it's like a dance. Yeah, I've had lots of people say to me, well, you could get hurt doing that. Well, our own logged evidence shows that actually when people actually have the mindset that they're not going to maintain a hold, even if someone's not calm, to let go, but in a controlled way with your colleagues, you're allowing a person to regulate. The most common stuff we found in autism and learning disabilities, often when you hold someone like this, people will sit themselves on the ground, you often do a controlled hold to lower them, and you back away. It's a dance. That's why the methods that we were taught originally were designed for those populations. They were not designed to contain a riot in the middle of a high street somewhere. No. That's one of the fundamental differences. But we've now found that these methods have been applied to other sectors, from the elder adults through to psychiatry. Most of our work in that field tends to be overseas, not in the UK. But the same principles, the same model can be used in a variety of sectors. But still, if you're minimalist, a lot of the organisations that we support tend to put more time and effort. They have fewer training days once they're using our system in physical interventions, but it does give them a trade-off that gives them a bit more wiggle room for staff coaching and de-escalation, and still save training days. Training is very expensive, particularly if it's unknown its impact and its effects. So I think our work, and I'm biased, works in the vast majority of situations. So over the years, we have found that this idea of, and not just intermittent holdings, also applies to if people grab you. The first thing you do if somebody grabs you is to relax. It's not to break free of a hold. But often what we get is this what if mentality all the time. What if somebody's got a knife and they've got a gun? What if there's 2 people with a knife and a gun? That's our own human fear catastrophizing. Training, even around an individual that's bespoke, can only really focus on the most common types of things that people need to learn. In Studio 3 now, my colleagues often teach bespoke evacuation drills to people. That doesn't mean to say run off and leave somebody, but it means how do you withdraw. In community homes, often we'll have people withdrawing using the Pied Piper method into the garden. Yeah. Now, for some people listening to this talk, I know many people here will probably have your own confirmation bias and like the lower arousal approach, but those who don't, part of the change process here is that we have to change our own behaviour. That's a central part of this. I did hold people down in the past. Yes, I know what it's like to be threatened with a knife. I'm often amazed how often people will dismiss some of the things that my colleagues and I say as if we have no expertise at all. Come on, we can do better than that, is what I usually say to them. But over the next 5 years, it is my intention, as I have more time given to me at Studio 3, my new role, I'm going to be focusing more time on campaigning on these issues around the world. I'm loud, I have an opinion, I can back it up with research. Doesn't mean to say I'm 100% right, but I think I'm down that end a little bit more than the average person out there when we're talking about this area. So, what we need to do is to move away from these areas. And also there's a whole area that I don't have time to talk to today, which is about decompressing people from existing holds and existing methods. That general area can be called restraint decompression or physical interventions decompressing, when actually an individual has almost been conditioned into expect the response of multiple staff. And what I will say to you is, I'm doing some research with my colleagues at that in the moment in this field, and it's very hard to expect somebody who is then traumatized in the first place, who's then traumatized by these methods, they then need to move into an environment where they're almost told we're not going to use those methods. This is what we're going to do. We're going to give you as much control over the situation as possible. But restraint decompression is not easy, and it's a very long-term approach. When I develop decompression programs, and I do a lot of them, we're talking in months and sometimes years, whereas some of the people we're working with are thinking in days and weeks. You cannot expect somebody overnight to move from a response where they've had people moving towards them, well-intentioned or not, holding them down, to suddenly move to a situation where that's not the case. But we have demonstrated by moving people in my work with my colleagues at Lives Through Friends, which is a not-for-profit organisation in this sector. We've moved people out of hospital into those settings, and we've trained staff specifically in bespoke methods to minimise this. And what I can tell you is we've done quite well. Not everyone needs years and years and years, bizarrely enough, to actually get used to that. But to do that, it means we need to also understand that person needs to feel safe. Abraham Maslow, the most famously quoted psychologist of the 20th century, near enough, talks about his pyramid of needs and his hierarchy. Most people have got that in their heads from somewhere from a lecture. But the base of his pyramid is safety. After safety, you can do many things. And it's perceived safety sometimes, not actual. So I'm very passionate that we can do more things in this field in the future. Take more people out of very expensive hospitalised placements, and over time, with the right early support, get people from a culture where of restrictions and control to a culture where they feel safe and controlled. That doesn't mean to say, having a 40-hour-a-week engaged program in the community, but it's a transition. And I do know that actually, when we do that, it's often cheaper than locking people up. So the whole point of this talk, and there are many other myths I could put, like Sisyphus in Greek philosophy, who kept on pushing the rock up the hill, nearly got to the top, and then it rolled down again. That sometimes, to me, is what it feels like when we're doing work in this field. I give you the clear caveat that I don't have the answers to everything, but I've spent the last 35 years, not only as a practitioner, but looking at the research in this field. And I do think, particularly for those of you in the UK and Europe, particularly, and I know there's some people from the US here, we have this opportunity at the moment. The narrative is changing over the decades. I wish it had changed quicker, but we're here where we are now. So for me, like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, what we need to get is to the top and then push it down the other side. Because once we do, we'll gain momentum. And that's where I am about the whole area of physical interventions. I still don't like talking about it today, but I think it's necessary that we have an open and transparent conversation about methods over the next year. My own organisation, I'm not necessarily in charge of Studio anymore. We hope to make whatever physical interventions by next summer transparent on our website, so people can see exactly what we will and will not teach. That's a challenge that we're going to put out across the industry around the world over the next year. So my idea with this is we're not dreamers, but Harriet Tubman, who amazing woman, if you ever get a chance to read about this woman who was a slave, who then was involved with the Underground Railways, getting slaves out of the Deep South, where if you were caught, if Harriet was caught, she would have been hung or lynched. Harriet Tubman lived to a very old age in her life, and her books are fascinating, but she's got a quote from it to me which just talks about dreaming and daring to dream. And what she says is that every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars and to change the world. I think there's enough of us who have that dream to say, let's make physical interventions. Let's not talk about restrictions and reductions. Let's talk about eradication wherever we can. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will stop there. There's more information on our website about our work. Little plug for one of my books. Oh, little plug for our online training, which takes place every Friday. Yeah, we want more people to be encouraged in this dialogue. And it's okay to challenge, it's okay to disagree, which hopefully we might show on the questions that come to this webinar. So my book, Freedom from Restraint and Seclusion, does describe our methods quite in detail, and it also gives people a sense of some of the issues in this field. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you and stop sharing at that point.